Welcome to this session on ethical considerations for research. Now, when you conduct your research, there will be ethical considerations that you have to think about and a process that you have to follow before you're allowed to conduct your research. And a number of the things that we're going to talk through in this video will be things that you have to evidence that you've considered and you've mitigated the risk on your participants. However, we need to think about ethical considerations at a much greater level than that. So you need to consider how you're impacting your participants, how your decisions for your research are impacting your data collection, and most importantly, how you're going to safeguard your participants and their data throughout the entire process. So there is quite a lot to think about. And in this short video, we're going to talk through a number of those considerations. Now, as a starting point, thinking about ethics can be quite overwhelming, and there's a lot of information out there that is there to guide you, but also is extensive. And you may forget about certain elements or be stuck with decisions that you have to make to protect your participants. So my suggestion would be you go and look at some of the guidance. There's lots of guidance out there. There's a number of core textbooks around research methods that will discuss ethical considerations, hopefully in quite a simple way for you, and talk you through some of the processes and some of the steps you should follow, but also more extensively, depending on the area that you're researching, there is a number of published guidelines that you should follow. So for example, if you're doing research in anything educational, you should follow BERA guidelines, which is ethical guidelines for educational research. If you're doing something more kind of attuned to sport and exercise science, then you should follow BASES and their ethics and participation in research, particularly their publication of young people, so conducting experiments or doing kind of sports science type tests with young people. And then we've also got a handbook of research ethics and scientific integrity, which often is used if you're doing something either sports science or sports psychology based. But even if you don't follow these guidelines and just follow a core textbooks, that will be good enough. But using these extended pieces of guidance will help you understand this at a greater level, but also ensure that you safeguard your participants effectively. So the first thing we're going to consider is informed consent. And there's a difference between consent and informed consent, which is what we're going to unpack as we go through this. Now, first of all, consent is required before data collection. So across every piece of research that you do, you need to make sure that the participants taking part in your study have consented to their data being used. And what we mean by data isn't just things like their name or age or sex and gender or personal things kind of about their identity, but we also mean, if you're going to interview them, the transcript of what they've said. So the kind of the sentences that you've written down to kind of follow what they've said in the interview. Or if they filled out a questionnaire, then the answers or the responses they provided. That is also their data. And before you can collect any data from participants, you do need to gather their consent to do so. Now, generally, you can't claim retrospective consent. And what that essentially means is if you collect data and then try and go back to the participants at a later date to kind of backfill consent, then that isn't allowed. So the participant needs to consent before their data is collected. And that has quite a big impact on your research, because essentially you have to go through the ethics process and then get consent from your participants, and getting their consent is a requirement to go through the ethics process before you can collect any data. And going through the ethics process will typically mean you need to have an understanding of the methods that you're going to employ. So if you're going to use interviews or questionnaires, you kind of need to know that, and you need to be able to justify that, which means that it knocks your data collection further down the road, because you have to go through that process first. But you have to do that, and you have to gain consent before you can collect any data. Now, that's the kind of minimum, and essentially you need to evidence gaining consent. So the usual way of collecting that is a consent form with a number of statements in, and then the participant was signed to say, I've read this, I understand it, and I agree, and you can use my data. And they will sign and date that Just bearing in mind, if you're doing this with under 18s, or if you're doing this with adults at risk or who are vulnerable, then you will also need a responsible adult or a parent or guardian to sign that on their behalf. So it's not just a case of the participant, unless they are an adult, but you will need to kind of evidence that consent. And the reason for that is because if something happens for your research, you need to have that evidence of the fact that they've given consent, because this could end up in, hopefully it won't, but this could end up in kind of a legal discussion, legal argument, and you need that evidence of their consent. Now, getting consent is really easy. You could think about like when you buy something online or you sign up to a website, a blog, a thread or something. Typically, it will say tick here to agree to the terms and conditions. And what you're essentially doing is giving consent to those terms and conditions. Now, the likelihood is we probably haven't read those, or we don't read those often. But by ticking that box, we are consenting to kind of what's within that. Now, that's consent, and we can do that on the day. You can interview people, you can turn up, and you can put a piece of paper down in front of them, and the likelihood is they probably won't read it, they'll probably sign it and date it, and you've got that consent. But that probably isn't enough to get through the ethics process, and even if it is, morally, it's not that effective, and we should think more about safeguarding the participants and helping them understand what they are consenting to. And that's where we kind of move into informed consent. Informed consent is usually required. It depends on the ethics committee in the institution that you're applying through. It is usually required, but not always. And informed means that the participant has a good understanding of the following, but maybe this list isn't exhaustive, so maybe more things as well. So, for example, the aim of the study. Now, it's important that they understand the aim of the study, because that gives them information about what the study is about, and then coming on to the next point, what they're being asked to do, and why they've been selected. And there's some really important questions to make sure that they're informed. So you can turn up and interview someone, and if they don't really have an idea about why they've been selected or what the study is about, they're not informed about the study, about the process. Now, typically we do that through an information sheet, so that might be several pages long, but we haven't got guaranteed that they're going to read that, so we could also follow that up with a conversation, or that could be recorded conversation, or it could just be an informal conversation, but we explain the points in the document, and we also give that person an opportunity to ask any questions. In addition to that, the participant needs to be informed about what we're going to do with their data, how long we're going to keep that data for, who else might have access, for example, supervisors of your study, any confidentiality arrangements that you have in place, withdrawal processes if they want to withdraw their data from being used. So essentially, you need to be confident that they, and or their responsible adult, if that's necessary, understands the study, the purpose, why them, etc. And that's informed consent, and that's a much longer process to ensure with our participants, but also it has some positive consequences for us, because we're less likely that the participant is going to complain about how the data is being used or the questions that they were asked, and they're probably going to respond in a more informed way, which gives us more reliable data as well. So not only are we safeguarding the participant, but hopefully we're gathering higher quality of data because of that process. Okay, confidentiality. So we need to ensure, usually we need to ensure confidentiality, and we do that by ensuring that the participant's data is anonymous. And that's the norm. So we might withhold their names, or really any piece of information that can be used to identify who that person is. Now, in larger scale studies, that's really easy, because it's hard to identify who's who, because we might be doing a study in the whole of the UK, and it's unlikely across millions and millions of people that anyone's going to identify who that person is based on the information they provide, as long as we withhold their name, their address and stuff like that. In smaller scale studies, particularly case studies, that can be more challenging. So, for example, we might work with a local primary school or a local sports club. And confidentiality can be really tricky in these environments because other people in that same environment can pick up your research once it's published, and they might be able to work out who's who relatively quickly. So confidentiality isn't a complete guarantee that that person will be anonymous, but it's making sure we can make them as anonymous as we can and informing them about the processes we're going to take to do that, how confident we are of that process, but also maybe any risks that other people might be able to identify them, just so that, again, they're fully informed about their process. Now, to do that, we could consider using what's called pseudonyms. And pseudonyms essentially is a fake name. And the real reason, or the real positive for doing this, in my opinion, is that it can help the flow of your writing. So an obvious way of ensuring confidentiality is removing names and giving everyone a code like participant A, participant B, participant C. But when we write and we include them in a discussion, it becomes quite disjointed. So we might give everyone a fake name. So we give them an actual name, but obviously that's a fake name to them. Now, if you do that, it's really important that you keep a record of it. Because obviously if you're changing their names, you need to have that who's who, because you don't want to accidentally slip into using the wrong name in your writing. But also, as we'll get to a little bit later on, whilst we're ensuring confidentiality, we're not ensuring confidentiality from you as the researcher. So you will still know who's who, but you're trying to keep that information private from the public. Now, confidentiality isn't always possible, like we spoke about earlier, so you need to think about how do you minimize that risk. And participants can waive confidentiality. Unless you're an experienced researcher or you're studying something very specific, I would definitely not advocate that you only accept participants who are willing to waive confidentiality. But they might say they don't want confidentiality and they want to be in the study in terms of the results, with full disclosure as to who they are. It depends on what you're studying. The things I've been involved in so far, I've not seen a need for that to happen. Even if they've been willing to waive confidentiality, it doesn't add any value to the research. So kind of would rather protect the participant from any unintended consequences of them being disclosed. Now, if participants do ask the withdrawal, you need to be confident that you know whose data is whose. So, for example, if they're doing questionnaires and you give them all out and then they give them all back, but they haven't recorded their name, well, how do you know whose is whose? Now, you might not want them to record their name, but you might have a code on each questionnaire that's different, and then a central document that says questionnaire 1 is, questionnaire 2 is, etc. If you're interviewing people, then you might have a code of interview A was, etc. But you'll keep all of that information confidential from the wider public. Okay, data storage. Data storage is really important. Well, all of this is really important from a legal perspective, but with data storage, we have to comply to GDPR. So it is your legal duty to ensure participants and their data is stored safely and securely, and participants know what data you are keeping and for how long. We just have to abide by that. There's in terms of the legal parameters that we're sitting within, in terms of doing research, we have to do that. So as an absolute minimum, participants need to know those things and consent to those things. Now, a couple of different ways a couple of typical ways of storing data or storing interviews or questionnaires, etc., is electronic storage and paper documents. If we're doing electronic storage, password protected laptop is, I would say, is a must, but there might be other ways, but that would be my preference. If you're going to store stuff on a cloud, think about who has access. And I know this might seem a bit unnecessary, but if you're storing it on an institution cloud, the IT department, for example, will have access. The likelihood of them ever seeing that or doing anything with that information is probably near zero, but technically they have. And unless you get the participants to understand that and consent to that, which you could do, I would just say keep it off a cloud, keep it on your laptop. Now, I appreciate you might be worried about what if your laptop something happens to it or it breaks. So you might want to think about how you keep a backup, but you need to think about who can see this and has the participant agreed to that. Do they understand that? And if you've got paper documents, lock storage. If you're in a shared building, an office type building, like locked filing cabinet where only you have the key. If you're at home, I'm assuming you will live with people or other people might access your home in terms of coming around to visit. So still locked storage, but we just need to make sure that no one else can access that. So think carefully about what you're asking for and what you are keeping. And what we shouldn't do is collect data that's unnecessary. So if the age is unnecessary to what we're going to discuss, then don't ask for it. And I guess the problem with this is quite often we start collecting data without a full understanding of what's actually useful to us. So we need to think carefully about what do we need, what are we going to use to discuss, which means we need a good understanding of the literature base, and then we can make some decisions about what we do want to gather and therefore what we don't need to gather, and only gather what's essential and what's necessary. So things like name, age, sex and gender, ethnicity, why do we need those things? There might be some really useful reasons for collecting those, and that might help us with our data collection and our discussion. And great, if that's the case, collect it. But if not, we don't need to collect those pieces of information about people. The next thing to consider is right to withdrawal. And participants should be able to withdraw their data after they've taken part. So once they've handed the questionnaire in, once they've taken part in the interview, once they've taken part in the experiment, whatever your research design is, they need to have an appropriate amount of time to say to you, I would like you to withdraw my data. I no longer wish you to use it. That might be because they've said something controversial. They're worried about the ramifications of what they said, or there might be another issue that's arisen, or they might. It's not our prerogative to know why. They might just say to you, actually, I just don't want you to use it anymore. Now, there needs to be a clear process to do so. We cannot keep that hidden or put it in the small print. We need to be very clear with how participants do that. And that could be as simple as emailing you as the researcher, but they need to know how to do that. So quite often in your information consent form, you'll say you have a right to withdraw. This is how you do it. So you send an email to whatever your email is and you state that you wish to withdraw. No reason has to be provided, and you give them a deadline to do so. But that deadline needs to be reasonable. So for example, if you're doing it one day after data collection, after you interview them or collect the questionnaires, that isn't reasonable. But also, if you've got a final deadline to publish this and they email you one day before you're about to publish it, that isn't reasonable for you. So you've got to find a date that's reasonable, gives them plenty of time after, but also doesn't put unnecessary pressure on you to find another interview or to remove their data from what you've written about. So consider the sensitivity of your data collection. That could have an influence on how likely the participant is to withdraw. If they're going to say stuff that's controversial about employers or about colleagues, for example, or bring up some psychological consequences, or cause some psychological consequences, the likelihood of them withdrawing, I'm sure, is higher, because they're unsure about whether they should have disclosed those sensitive pieces of information and whether they actually want that in the public domain. And then the final thing that we're going to consider in this video is potential harm from participation. Now, you're required as a researcher to consider the duty of care for your participants, including identifying and minimizing potential risks. Now, some studies are relatively simple. You're interviewing or questionnaire people, they're over 18, there isn't any physical or psychological kind of issues to what you're asking. It's a very light touch process that we have to go through in terms of potential harm. Some studies are more complicated, particularly if we're talking about vulnerable adults or children. That point on the right says it. The more vulnerable the participant, the greater your responsibility. But also it could be that particular topics mean that you have to think about this a lot more. And that isn't, I'm not trying to get you to think what topic would be the easiest, but you need to think, what am I interested in studying? And does that lead to potential physical, psychological harm to participants? Are they thinking about or bringing up previous experiences that might be negative and might have an emotional state on them, for example? And like I've said, that will have an impact on the ethical process in terms of what you need to consider and how you might mitigate some of those risks. So as a summary, use guidance. There's plenty of guidance out there, BERA, BASES, lots of textbooks. Use it. It will walk you through what to consider ethically, how to go through the process, and then how you can protect your participants and safeguard your participants, and then hopefully that will lead to higher quality data. Things that we've considered in this video: gather informed consent, not just consent. Inform your participants, an information sheet and a discussion after where they have an opportunity to ask you questions. Ensure confidentiality, including potentially using pseudonyms. Store their data appropriately, password protected laptops, locked filing cabinets or locked storage if it's paper copies. Ensure participants have a right to withdraw. They know the process of how to withdraw and they know the deadlines that they're working towards the withdrawal. You might even give them a reminder at the end of the data collection process that you can withdraw up to this date and this is how. And consider any potential harm that might arise from participating in the research, and then how you might mitigate that and put steps in place to mitigate that if you believe that there might be some psychological or physical distress or issues that might arise from taking part in your research.